Okay, so I may be about to violate or work around the brief I was given to introduce the theoretical origins of the discipline and then hand over to Janet, because I think I'm about to introduce the theoretical origins of everything that isn't resilient healthcare. So let's see about that. But yeah, I have a day job. I work at Staffordshire University and I run a master's course in human factors for patient safety. We're distance learning online, so we're open for applications from all around the place. I'll start with Taylorism. So a long time ago, but still very influential, Taylor essentially says we need to fit people to tasks. So this is the birth of scientific management. We're going to design tasks, design training, and then people are going to carry out that work. Fair days pay for a fair day's work, but the work is organised and controlled by the management. This is where we get the birth of quality improvement, standard operating procedures, high reliability, and everything else that follows from that. We get safety management systems as well, and we get monitoring, we get process control, we get run charts, audits, continual improvement. This is the roots of work as imagined and work as done, whereby the management are going to set out the scene and other people are going to carry out the work. This is the birth as well of people just being cogs in the machine. Very top-down management theories. Safety comes along, and essentially Heinrich is normally cited as the birth of safety science. None of what I say you can't now find from AI. It's all out there on the internet. Very important, Heinrich's concerned with costs, as in literal costs, because working in insurance, there's no humanity here. We're not interested in well-being. We're actually literally trying to stop people costing money. And Heinrich's work is empirical, but drawn from Taylor. He doesn't ask the workforce anything about their work. There's no asking people about their field rationality or their everyday hassles in the way that they work around work. He just asks supervisors and managers what goes wrong in accidents. Very interesting because of the culture of the day. Heinrich's model is called the accident sequence, also known as domino theory, which again is just because of literally because of the diagrams in the book, which you can read online now. It's all available. And this is where we get root cause and linearity. So we've got injury at the end, caused by accident, caused by unsafe acts, caused by the fault of the person. There is one cause at this stage, which is you, the person. Blame is not something epiphenomenological. It doesn't blame culture. It's absolutely fundamental and foundational to safety from the very beginning. From the very beginning, it's built in, and it retains, it sustains. And at the back end, we get nature and nurture, social environment and ancestry. It's also deeply racist at the time, as you can imagine, 100 odd years ago in America. So really influential, reactive, deficit-based, because we're focusing on accidents, linear, simplistic, reductive, and we have the root cause, and essentially blame culture. I can read that out for you. In accident prevention, the bullseye of the target is in the middle of the sequence. The unsafe act, which I'll come back to, of the person, or mechanical or physical hazard. But the mechanical and physical hazards are caused by the person as well. So we're not into the era of technical failure yet. Management control, that's Taylor. The man failure, there's a lot of men. There's a lot of men in this story. Knowledge, attitudes, fitness, ability causes the unsafe act and causes the unsafe conditions. It's all blame. Right? Heinrich also is like comes up with this idea of a sort of ratio of minor events of near misses, if you like, zero harm events to minor events to major events, which I'll come back to. We get from, and Frank Bird popularizes this, and this is where we get this notion of common cause. We get this idea of constantly looking at minor incidents and reporting them in order to try and identify the causes of major accidents, which is something very interesting when you try and translate it to healthcare, which doesn't have the same type of events. So we might come back to. But so the common cause is that we can find, we can find stuff in the systems, again, things that go wrong, which on average are are going to help us stop the major losses and the major costs and so on. This is where we get near miss reporting, endless coding events, and so on. What's perhaps less well known as part of the story is that at the time, we're in the grip of behaviorism. Basically, psychology has physics envy. It wants to be a serious science. It doesn't want to pay any attention to what people say. It doesn't want people to self-report, to talk about their work, to say how they feel, to say what it is that they do, because this is unscientific and unobservable. And the mind and brain is set aside. We call it the black box. We just have stimulus and response. We have punishment and reward, and people are conditioned to behave in certain ways. It's quite important. Again, so we have behavioral safety going alongside essentially scientific management and blame. Safety then gets sexy. You know the story. It's the modernism is really continuing. We have commercial aviation, nuclear power, individualism, capitalism, etc. We like all that. It's all thrusting and again very paternalistic. And so we have these engineered systems, and this is the kind of stuff I'm sure many people know about. We can specify them. They're complicated, but there's a plan. And therefore, we can decompose them to get understanding. They're complicated, but we can find and fix the faults. Reliability comes in here in a big way. We get failure modes, safety cases, barrier analysis, risk assessment, technical, rational, and reliability based. But what about the humans? They're still there. Well, Chomsky says behaviorism is gross and superficial, which most people would agree with. Doesn't do justice to the human experience. So we got a bit of humanity coming in. But really importantly, there are a whole series of experiments, which I won't mention, which show essentially that the poor rats of behaviorism in their little experiments have adaptive capacity, right? They have a mental model. They actually act upon their environment. They work around things. Some brilliant experiments that show that. So cognition comes into play, but we still have the problem of how to scientifically study cognition. We still want to be a real science. So we think, okay, there's something to this. People are acting on this in their environment. If rats are, people definitely are. But how are we going to study that? Well, computers. So people become information processing devices. Information processing theory is everything in psychology, more or less still to this day, despite deep critiques. And this is, essentially we have sensory input, we filter it, encode it, rehearse it, or whatever into memory, we process it, and then behavior comes from these processes. And this is where, if you like, human error comes in, because these essentially now talking about process errors. People analogous with information processing devices called cognitivism. It's what underpins all human error. Jim Reason on the right here keeps the unsafe acts from Heinrich and then takes the rational processing model from Rasmussen on the left, the skill rule knowledge type processing, and this is what and comes up with the error taxonomies that you probably know about: slips, lapses, mistakes, and violations. And now we're not conditioning people to do work, we're programming people. And this is work as imagined, if you like. So we have endless protocols, and the idea is people are rational and will simply follow these algorithms, very much like the way engineered systems work. There's no adaptation or anything involved in this. It's reliability based, technical. People are assimilated, right? So complicated systems. People are components in the system. We're still on the deficit base, trying to avoid risk and failure, but we now have the twin causes of human error or technical failure. Now, I am going on about safety one, if you like, but resilient healthcare is and wasn't solely reactionary. At the time of all these developments, there was always a counterpoint, if you like. So the joint cognitive systems ideas are deeply sort of important in terms of they're trying to say it's not human or technical. It's an interactive system. Basically, the outputs come from dynamic interactions. They emerge from that interaction between the human and the technology, and the human acts on the technology. So that's the start of a real kind of systems viewpoint. But when we get to 3 Mile Island and the major industrial accident era, we've still got the dichotomy. It persists for a long time, and we still see, as reading about it this week with events in America, that this accident, the result of technical malfunctions and human error, right? Still still roughly where we are. This is into the 70s, except fashion is always important in these things. Fashion is always important. And what happens in the 70s? We're not having it anymore, right? We essentially get feminism, we get discussions of power and the patriarchy, and we get sociology, and we just don't believe now that management have our best interests at heart, and actually that they are best placed to tell us how to do our own work. And loads of threads there. And I often ask my students what accident this is, and none of them know, and I'm sure people don't know. And it's quite surprising because this happens on the outskirts of London. It's a major metropolitan area, and over 200 people die. And you would think it would be something that people would recognise at first glance, but the reason they don't is there's no television. So the other thing that happens by the time we get to the 70s is the major organisational accidents play out live stream, if you like, in front of us. And safety becomes all about the big one. It becomes very hard to put this down to simple things like human error and simple things like simple bits of technology failing. So people start to become interested and say, well, there must be something bigger going on here. And Bob Weir's calls these events, the mass and dread events. Safety becomes all about avoiding the big one. Remember, Heinrich has it that we do that by focusing on the minutiae and the everyday sort of minor events in order to try and stop these big things happening. So we're getting into, if you like, the full organizational end of safety. Again, alongside this, we have naturalistic decision-making from Klein and others that people have worked out that we're not rational. That's basically the thrust of that literature. We make snap decisions, fast decisions based on quick pattern recognition. So there's something really dynamic about that. Essentially, it's the start of a discussion of situated cognition. Decisions in context was a big part of what we're all interested in. And of course, we have normal accident theory, which has started to get against that common cause hypothesis and saying, actually, there's something about, these big complex systems and the big accidents that's etiologically different. And that leads us to, stuff like Richard Cook and why complex systems fail and so on. So again, we're going along. However, back in the mainstream, Jim Reason goes on the journey from human error to organizational accidents. And what happens is we just take the same model with us. We have a chance here to do full systems theory because we start to see how complex things are. We've really got a chance to try and represent systems and study systems. And I've missed out some aspects of the story just for time. I've stuck my own wee book there in the middle. Jim Reason goes beyond human error into organizational accidents, but he still keeps it reductive and decomposable and linear. And that image there on the right-hand side of Reason's book is the one here. And this is where patient safety comes in. And I don't mean theoretically, I mean literally the people, the personalities, the people, the way that patient safety engages with the psychology and the engineering community is direct. This is where it comes from. Patient safety comes in. We have the barrier analysis along the top. You'll be familiar maybe with the Swiss cheese analysis, that the linear accident trajectory stuff. And down the bottom, we just take the model of was it human or technical failure, and we just extend it to organizational factors. So we just have essentially a bigger taxonomy, and we still have linearity. And essentially, we've got a root cause analysis coming up from the bottom. We still in the middle have unsafe acts from Heinrich. So everything still goes through the person. So you've got these factors in the organization, but they still cause the people to do something wrong, which breaches the defenses, which leads to the loss. We still have loss from Heinrich. It's all the threads are still deeply present. And so just to finish off, we have safety by taxonomy in healthcare, and this is the WHO model, where we're reporting events and investigating them because of the common cause ideas. We have linear trajectories and root causes. It's very deficit based and it's still reductive. We have error, behavior, and now we just add technical faults and we add organizational factors. Now, that's the last straw, really, I would say, because like the technical rational model kind of works for the control room and for the devices and for the proximal. But once you start to to extend it into things like training and culture and environment and all of these things. It just doesn't fit. We don't have systems theory. And again, there are threads then that bring us to brought me anyway. This is a personal story, to thinking that this whole world of resilient healthcare was really what we wanted to get interested in. General systems theory, feedback loops, emergence and complexity, and of course sociological treatments of accidents. And that's all very important stuff. So that's where I think we then get to hand over to Janet. We want something that's much more dynamic, where people, interact with the systems. They're not just a component part in them, and it's inactive. So again, not passive like information processors. We actually are going to work around procedures, use them as tools, and roll our sleeves up and get on that field rationality. And obviously we need to deal with the complex and the emergent. And essentially, for me, it's a whole history of coming to trying to put the social, really, if you like, in the socio-technical. And so that's where I would then pass on to Janet for like the implications.
Thanks, Al, for a potted history through the development of safety sciences. It's really fascinating to think about how we got here. And what I want to try and do now is think about what the implications are for what we actually do. And I'm going to just start off with thinking about the fact that we need a theory of healthcare work. I've always thought that it's very odd that we try to improve something, but we don't actually have a well-articulated theory of how it actually works and how successful outcomes are meant to be achieved. And why is this important? Well, because theory actually helps us to have a tool for thinking about and discussing a problem. It's about proposing an explanatory framework for why things work the way they are. And what that allows us to do is name what we observe, try and explain the relationships between concepts and our observations, and try to think about how we can bring about change, as well as identifying what we don't know and helping us to develop general kind of principles for solving similar problems in different times and places. And I think this is absolutely crucial for helping us to improve healthcare. What does a healthcare work theory, for want of a better term, need to include? Well, it needs to include all of the things that we know well in RHC: uncertainty about goals, risks and evidence. We know that healthcare work has all of those things inherent in it. Variability in patient needs, valuable treatments, other work demands that are happening at the same time. In other words, multiple conflicting goals and trade-offs. We know that the systems are pretty poorly designed. There's pretty poorly designed and maintained equipment and technology. Few strong systemic barriers, so there's a reliance on training and reminders, which we know are not very effective. And this is all set against a backdrop of highly complex policy and regulatory frameworks with many actors, constant change, overlapping responsibilities and competing goals. So our current theories about how to improve don't really take this into account, if they can even be called theories. I don't think they can be. Most improvement work is not based on an articulated theory of healthcare work, but I'd like to argue that RHC is. And that's because it offers a deeper understanding of the complexity in healthcare systems and why it gives us some understanding of why it's so hard to improve. It highlights the need for safe flexibility based on clinical judgment, or in other words, resilience or adaptation. It emphasises system design as a way to reduce variation. And notice that we're not talking about controlling a system so that we can eliminate variation. We're emphasising system design as a way to reduce variation, to make variation a bit more predictable, if you like. it's really about proactively strengthening the system rather than responding exclusively to past incidents. And there's a really strong emphasis on understanding everyday work and staying close to it, to what's going on in practice. And as Al said, moving beyond human error as an explanation. Error is viewed as a consequence of system design. And I think this is also sometimes a sticking point. People think, well, sometimes people do make errors. Well, true, but maybe analysing those errors to the nth degree doesn't really help us in moving forward. But if we start to think about error, what we view as error, as a consequence of system design, it gives us much more leeway to think about how to improve. So I think resilient healthcare can be viewed as a theory. It gives us concepts to structure the problem that we're dealing with. It provides us with methods to investigate problems and help to find solutions, which I'll talk about a bit more as we go on. It's fundamentally a complex systems perspective. So we view healthcare as a system of interconnected elements that interact in non-linear ways. And because of that complex interaction between all those things that I've listed up there, including the external environment, you have systems adapting over time. So they're very dynamic. And because of that, behaviour emerges over time due to the interaction of all these elements. So we can't understand what's going on, or we can't understand how a system operates or how a system normally behaves by understanding only, or by focusing on only one element. And we know that effects are non-linear. They can occur at different times and places in unpredictable ways. So fundamentally what this means is that a complex system cannot be fully specified or controlled. And even if we try to intervene in that system, the way the system responds to our intervention is going to be partly non-linear, partly unpredictable, emergent, and so on. And so all of this needs to be taken into account in how we proceed. And it suggests fundamentally that what we need to do is identify how to shift a system towards more desirable behaviour patterns. So we're shaping and shepherding a system towards the point that we want it to be, because we understand that we can't fully control it, we can't fully specify it, we can't predict how it's going to respond. And this all strongly suggests that we have to develop a really good understanding of the whole system and stay very close to it so that we've got more chance of shifting it in the way that we want. So implications for research and practice. Obviously, fundamentally, studying and understanding everyday work is vital for this proactive shifting of the system towards a desirable point that I've been talking about. We've got no chance of doing that unless we understand what on earth is going on day to day. Obviously, we also understand that systems have different levels and we need to understand all of those levels. At the moment, as many people have pointed out, we've focused very much on the micro level. So we also need to start to question how decisions at higher levels of the system or other levels of the system affect resilience, and start to ask things like, what does resilient management and regulation look like? But fundamentally, what it means is that ensuring safety is a continuous process. These systems are open to many external pressures and are constantly changing. So even if we identify a problem and identify a successful intervention, they won't remain fixed for very long, as I'm sure people working in this area will know. So what we're signing up to here is not the quick fix. It's not the scientific idea that you can intervene at a particular point and therefore your problems will be solved and the effect will be predictable forever in a nice linear way. What we're signing up for here is a much more complex process of ensuring that safety is continuously focused on and that we understand how that system works. The system is the unit of analysis, so we engage in a lot of system mapping and modelling, as you can see on the right-hand side there. But we also have a lot of qualitative analysis of those interactions with a lot of the RHC work that we've published and that's on the website and presented at the conferences focuses a lot on this. There's simulation and prediction, which is less frequently used. But we need to really strongly recognise that this understanding that we develop from these activities is always partial, it's always subjective, and it's always constantly changing. We're not trying to measure reality reliably, but we're trying to understand multiple realities and changing perspectives. And you can see, as I've been talking, that we're really fundamentally challenging the scientific model underlying the quality improvement activities, safety activities that are currently ongoing. We're fundamentally challenging how people view what is going on, and we're proposing a different way forward. So how should we proceed? So this is a bit more guidance, I suppose. First thing is that I'm suggesting is that we should determine the suitability of a problem or a project or whatever it happens to be for this approach. It's probably likely to be resource intensive, and maybe it's better use of resources to think about applying it when we have repeated problems, we have patterns of incidents. We're talking about particularly complex coordination across teams, units and system boundaries, and or solutions that are likely to require high investment of time or resources. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we should recognise that our aims, particularly at the start, are going to be broad and exploratory. They're going to be based on understanding the work in a deep manner before we propose interventions. And this is completely contrary to the way science would like us to proceed. Similarly, we need to define the boundaries of the system under investigation. So I think this is quite a missing point sometimes in our work. We need to think about which bit of the system, we can't do the whole system at once, but which bit of the system are we going to focus on? And we need to be prepared to broaden the scope as necessary as the work progresses. So we might, for instance, start off with a fairly tight system boundary. I'll give you some examples of this in a minute. But we might start off with a very tight system boundary and after some investigation of work is done, discover that actually another part of the system is crucial. So we might broaden our investigation. And so what I'm saying here is that our aims and scope may change as the project progresses. We also need to be prepared to trade off depth and breadth of focus in an informed way. And I'll talk about this in a minute. But basically what I'm talking about is breadth being the amount of the system that our investigation is encompassing, and the depth being the depth at which we can delve into work as done. And the last thing is we need to give quite a lot of thought to how we're going to understand or map out work as done using qualitative or quantitative methods. This is just some examples of projects that Al and I have done, or mostly Al and I have done, with different system boundaries. So Al's been particularly instrumental in looking at whole systems of care across Scotland, primary care dentistry and care homes for older people. And you can see here the trade-off between depth and breadth. So in the primary care dentistry project, there was a focus on one function, which was, now I've forgotten what it was, fluoride varnish. But across the whole of Scotland. So we traded off this breadth across the whole of Scotland with, balanced that with focusing on only one dentistry function. Similarly, care homes across the whole of Scotland focused on mapping demand and capacity, didn't look at the whole of everything that affected that care. People will be familiar with our work in emergency departments, older people's care, and these were organisational units where we bounded the investigation according to the ward or the unit that was involved, but found various ways to link to other parts of the hospital. In one case, in a sub-study, in another case by having focused interviews about how the rest of the system impacted the unit. And the same with the study, the later study of ward teams across the whole hospital. And then finally, we've done a study, this was a study I did with Natalie Sanford, actually, who may be online, looking at patient identification in outpatient clinics in a single hospital. So it was physically bounded. The system that we looked at was physically bounded by the task, the patient identification task. But we had to include links with referrers, and specialists, because they were crucial in determining how patient identification happened. So we had quite a tight system boundary, but included links outside that boundary. So this is what I'm talking about, what I'm thinking about. We need to be much clearer about how we think about systems and how we take into account what's in and out of scope. And we need to have that eye open as we're going into these systems to whether that needs to be revised as the system goes on. Capturing work has done a lot of work focuses on qualitative observations and interviews. There's a couple of suggestions there focusing on work, understanding the work, and focusing on activity, not non-compliance, which is a particular challenge when I've collaborated with colleagues who have a clinical background. They're often looking for non-compliance, and reframing that to focus on activity is quite a challenge. And then, of course, we can also look at quantitative data. Al and I, again, did a quantitative study looking at data on emergency department admissions and discharges, and probably others in the meeting now have done similar things. And that was simply building a statistical model of the factors affecting outcomes, discharge, admission and discharge. And that also is evidence of how work is done. And that could well generate insights that you may want to follow up with your qualitative work. So just moving on a bit to think about creating adaptive systems, we need to think about the need for structured flexibility. I think we need to start this discussion, and I know some colleagues in Norway obviously have, and probably elsewhere, about the balance between structure and flexibility, and start to be thinking about when is structure required. My work, there are some suggestions, when you've got very junior staff or new staff, unfamiliar situations, newly formed teams, poorly performing system, etc. That might be when more structure is required. Flexibility might be required when risks have been considered and discussed, and there's other issues that need to be taken into account rather than just safety. So patient preferences, for example. And we need to start thinking about what are the requirements for flexibility. Probably, I would suggest we need agreed and successful adaptations to be documented. We need some senior oversight. We need an experienced team. We need a discussion with stakeholders. And I think we need this to avoid the sense that anybody can do anything and it's an adaptation and it's resilience. Adaptations may solve immediate problems. Of course, we know this. But create problems that become obvious at different temporal and spatial scales. So we need to be quite careful about that. And that's why I think we need to have those discussions about the requirements of flexibility. And of course, we know that adaptations shouldn't be used to compensate for poor design. This is where the whole idea about, anything you need to do to solve a problem in the minute is good adaptation, may not be. And this constant cycle of problem solving leaves very little time for innovation and improvement. And so this is where the design comes in to try and reduce that constant adaptation that really should not be necessary if the system was designed much better. So how do we intervene? Just quickly, I think we need to be much more focused on what we're trying to do with our interventions. If it's a resilience or an RHC-based project or a resilience intervention, fundamentally what we're trying to do is help staff to adapt safely. So we need to design the system so that they're better able to do things that will enable them to adapt. And I've used here the resilience activities that Holnagel has proposed, but others might have their own things that they need to think about in terms of supporting adaptation. But basically, our interventions are to improve those things, and therefore our evaluation metrics must include those outcomes. How does the intervention support resilience? Does it help responding? Does it help monitoring? Does it help anticipation and so on? And that is our process indicator, if you like, and that's the missing link between our intervention and our outcomes. Pitfalls to avoid, sorry, I'll just quickly go through this. Pitfalls to avoid, we don't just mean it learning from what goes right, which you sometimes hear people saying in relation to safety too. And as you can tell, it's a much more complex, nuanced perspective than that. We need to avoid confusing RHC with similar sounding approaches. And we need to avoid focusing on individual worker behaviour, the care of individual patients, rather than how the system supports the care of individual patients. We need to avoid focusing on error rather than the causes of performance variability. And we need to avoid focusing on compliance, not the causes of adaptation. And more broadly, there are many opportunities to incorporate these principles into a range of activities, but that's a kind of pitfall that people often fall into, that it can only be used for a narrow set of circumstances. But I think there's lots of opportunity to build it in. And finally, we shouldn't mistake RHC for a technique or an intervention. It's a way or a theory of modelling how a system works. And we use that model and that understanding as a basis for decision making. And hopefully we feed back that understanding into theoretical development. So basically it's designed for continuous improvement, complex problems, proactive approach, complementing existing improvement methods. You saw, I don't suggest it's used for everything. And I think it's got the potential to improve intervention design and sustainability and lead to more effective quality improvement. So I shall finish there.